Before we go to questions and answers, there are a couple of issues that I wanted to address. So let me just start off with those issues. One, the tendency to assume that the Indic side is a side which always holds or wields the lathi and is incapable of engaging in an intellectual discussion is not just a stereotype that is pushed by the other side, but we have also contributed to it. I'll name a few organizations and let us see what you think of those organizations. You've heard of People's Union for Civil Liberties, Human Rights Law Network. Each of these organizations are clearly not organizations which subscribe to an Indic worldview. These organizations subscribe to a left of center viewpoint. These organizations subscribe to a different ideological standpoint altogether. Why is it that in no free speech debate or in a privacy issue or on issues with respect to women's rights or with respect to LGBT rights or with respect to tribal rights or environmental issues, we are not to be found anywhere at all? For the simple reason that we have allowed these issues to be co-opted and hijacked by the other side. And two, we have never fundamentally put faith in developing our arguments within the constitutional framework. That is not an option that has been on the table for a very long time. Consequently, if you have not treated a constitutional debate as an option on the table which you have to work upon, you will always think of it as too much of an intellectualism. You will say this is too much of academic discussion which I'm not interested in. Today it has come to a point that academics and so-called buddhijeevis are the people who are dictating the course of the national discourse on all issues of major concern, starting from deputation to privacy to whatnot. What does this show? That despite having a tradition of debating and despite having ancestors like Shankaracharya to look up to, this is a side today which has not lived up to those traditions for the simple reason that you have abandoned those traditions. We are more than happy to do the grassroots work, but we are not interested in actually developing it into a certain argument. It's important. Every issue has at least 3 or 4 layers. One is the intellectual layer, where it's an argument between two people who are qualified in the particular subject. Second is an argument between people who are grassroots workers, who are activists. Therefore, there has to be a different skill set which you need for that particular thing. Then there is a middle layer where you have a public intellectual who can bridge the gap between the grassroots worker and the intellectual and can reach out to the common audience. I'll give you a simple example, and this goes back to the discussion I had just before the talk. If you look at the number of articles which speak of the Ram Janmabhoomi case or the verdict of the Allahabad High Court of 2011, most of them peddle this particular belief that the decision is based on the concept of faith, that as opposed to the actual evidence which the judges considered for years together. This is the power of narrative, and this is the power of having an intellectual ecosystem at your disposal. Why is this important? Facts entirely go to the dustbin and narrative takes over the moment you have an ecosystem which is capable of reaching out to the public. How many of you who have actually read or let's say have heard of the Ram Janmabhoomi case have managed to pick up the judgment and read it? It's publicly available, anybody can read it. Instead, we choose to go with information that is given to us through the media. And the media has managed to convince us that as far as this judgment is concerned, it was based entirely on faith. We have not even asked this commonsensical question. At the end of the day, it's a court of law. How can a court of law come out with a verdict on facts and law based entirely on faith without evidence to support its conclusions? This defies logic, doesn't it? If the judgment is fundamentally based only on faith and does not have any basis or foundation in facts or in evidence and or law, how is it that it has been passed in the first place by a court of law? Then the judgment is fundamentally ridiculous is the conclusion that you have to come out with, which is not the case. Because if it was that ridiculous, the Supreme Court would have reversed it. All this shows what? Today, we whine, we gripe, and we constantly complain about the lack of an ecosystem, using all sorts of excuses available to us, saying we don't have the material resources. Although there is a certain dispensation in power today, it has not committed those resources to patronizing a certain intellectual ecosystem. But the fact of the matter is this: any support that comes from the state can only encourage an existing talent pool. Where is the talent pool that we have created today? The state cannot create talent. The state can only encourage talent. The state can only act as a force multiplier as far as an existing talent pool is concerned. How many of us have taken serious interest in Indology? In coming out with textbooks which are not written by foreigners as far as our history is concerned? Why is it that every major textbook and every major commentary on Indic studies comes from people who are not from Indian institutions and who are not of Indian origin? Because we have entirely abandoned it. One of the fundamental reasons that we find ourselves in the situation is we have lost the battle as far as humanities is concerned. We are so hell-bent on churning out engineers and medical professionals and people of all sorts of views except in the humanities side. You have allowed humanities to be taken over by someone with a vested interest without realizing that humanities constantly affects your life on a daily basis. If you're watching television, if you're watching a news channel, or if you're reading a history textbook, or if you're reading something related to literature, each of these things relate to humanities. If you look at people from our side today, so-called Indic side, who are focusing on humanities, we have done it only on a part-time voluntary basis. And then after the age of 50, after having earned all the wealth that we can, we then decide that I need to dedicate my life to this particular side, and then I start becoming an expert on history, on Sanskrit and whatnot. Compare that with the other side, and you have the answer crystal clear right in front of you as to why we are where we are today. You go to this place called Bastar. How many of you have heard of this place called Bastar? Why is that place famous for? McDonald's? No. What is it famous for? No, it's otherwise the Red Belt. For all practical reasons, it's the Red Belt. Go to Bastar and ask yourself, how many groups which are left of center are based out of Bastar, and how many groups which are right of center are based out of Bastar? We are nowhere to be found in the field. We are nowhere there at all. Law students, young law students have managed, or even young students of any humanity groups, they have been successfully packaged and sold this idea that free speech belongs to this particular camp, that civil liberties belongs to this particular camp, and therefore they are inclined to go there. Every idealistic impulse of a youngster is being tapped into by this particular side, whereas we are busy talking about justifying caste system and whatnot. You take every major publication on the right of center, their pet issues will be only this. One, Article 370. Point number one, how do you abolish reservations? Point number two. Point number three, no, the caste system is bad today, but that was not the original intention. We try and justify the past without understanding that you need to choose issues of the present for you to be relevant and for you to be able to reach out to people today. What the caste system was 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, does it really matter to a person who is actually, let's say, a victim of that particular system in any part of the country? It doesn't make a difference to him. You can keep shouting and crowing till the cows come home about the origins of the caste system or how great it was when it came out, but unless and until your action or your initiative is consistent with your belief, then you're all talk and no action. Now, let's look at also another system. Indians by default are driven by incentives. We are creatures of incentives. Unless and until there is an angle or there is a certain aspect which is helpful to you on the personal front, you really don't take the initiative. The other side has successfully managed to cultivate scholarships, fellowships, programs, incentives, all of which are fashionable. They are packaged in the best format possible. They are given the scholarly depth necessary, even if it's based on flimsy foundations, so that people aspire for it. There are, at any given point of time, there are so many students across universities, across streams, who aspire for Rhodes scholarships. Give me one example of a Rhodes scholarship which India has come out with in order to attract the best of brains from across the streams. You don't have a comparable scholarship at all. And if you were to read into the history of the Rhodes Scholarship, it was set up by perhaps one of the most racist persons of his time. And yet today, Rhodes Scholarship has become a symbol of egalitarian, universalist, and libertarian values. This is the power of narrative, where you're entitled to recraft and refashion history to suit your current agenda. We may have managed to understand how to crack the game of elections. We may have managed to come out with a decent machinery that wins one state after another. But at the end of the day, as far as the public narrative is concerned, and as far as the messaging is concerned, and as far as the intellectual ecosystem is concerned, you're nowhere close to it. For the simple reason that you have not invested sufficiently in it. And importantly, it is not the job of people on the index side or on the right of center side to defend the government. That's not your primary priority. That is not what you're meant for. Governments will come, governments will go. Dispensations will come, dispensations will go. You are fighting for a certain idea, you're fighting for a certain idea of India, you're fighting for an Indic civilizational narrative which has to transcend governments and time. Which means, and if I could give a very crude, unpopular example, or perhaps a politically incorrect example, it is rumored that the Communist Party of China has a civilizational narrative going for the next 100 years as to how it wants to be seen for the next 100 years. Regardless of who is in power, there is a consistency in terms of what China is and how it projects itself, what are its interests, and how does it go about protecting those interests. But as far as we are concerned, there is no Indic civilizational narrative. We do not have a clear picture as to who we are. We do not have a clear picture as to how do we represent ourselves to the world from a civilizational standpoint. We have not actually crafted that particular identity at all. This may be for a different reason also. Perhaps before India was politically united and became India as we know it today, each of these princely states and each of these regions may have had an individual identity. But the fact remains that at least for the outsider and the traveler who's come to this part of the world, he has seen a cultural commonality as far as all parts of the country are concerned. Therefore, whether or not there was this political concept of India which existed before 1947, the notion of India and the idea of India existed. Unfortunately, those building blocks of identity have not been used. We have not built on that particular identity because creation of an identity has very tangible consequences. Let's say today if I were to come out with a foreign policy or an immigration policy which says, I will not accept refugees into this country who come of a certain background, or I give it a positive twist. Only those refugees coming from an Indic background, meaning thereby Buddhists, Sikhs, Chakmas, Hindus, these are the only people, or Jains will be the only people who will be given the status of refugee as far as India is concerned. All others will be treated as illegal immigrants. What do you think will be the first public reaction to this, at least through the media? There will be a huge outcry that this is a communal position. They will say this is an anti-minority position. They will give it all sorts of names. That is for the simple reason that till date, after 70 years of the creation of this Republic of India, you still don't have a clear cultural identity. You do not have a civilizational narrative to present. You continue to allow third parties to craft your narrative. You have given them all the room that they need. Therefore, as far as I am concerned, the need of the hour is this. Perhaps the last wave was based on part-time volunteerism, where people out of their good intention decided to do something for the Indic side. After the age of 50, after the age of 40. But now you have arrived at a point where the battle of ideologies is visible for you to see on a day-to-day basis on every topic. Right from the murder of journalists, to immigration crisis, to reservations, to whatnot. Almost everything in India revolves around identity politics. Therefore, it has come to a point where you really need to give it its due and take an interest in it and start investing in it. Which means The next wave, as far as the Indic Renaissance is concerned, must consist of people who devote themselves to this cause full time. You need full-time journalists. You need full-time historians, full-time Indologists, full-time lawyers, people who take an active interest in this and build on this particular thing.